Hello and welcome back to the Musician's Map podcast. Weekly listeners will notice a lack of episodes for the last few weeks, as I've been on a bit of a break. Putting out a detailed episode each week by myself is a lot of work, and it started to get a bit stressful trying to deliver the standard of podcast you've come to expect, while also trying to balance work and life. From now on, the focus of the Musician's Map podcast will be on quality over quantity. I'll be releasing less podcasts, but they're going to be packed full of amazing content and even more amazing guests. So the best thing to do going forward is to like the Musician's Map podcast Facebook page, or join the Musician's Map Facebook group, or sign up to the email list, or all three, to make sure you're keeping up to date with what the new episodes will be about and when they'll be released. The new approach means I now have time to create content that I think is really useful and that I myself want to hear. And the incredible first episode of this new approach is what you're about to enjoy. But first, a little about my guest, Mary Zimmer. Mary is a classically trained singer, vocalist, and vocal coach, originally from Wisconsin, currently from Las Vegas, who specializes in metal and extreme music. She's played in bands like White Empress, Luna Mortis, and currently Santa Marta, and she has an awesome YouTube channel called VoiceHacks by Mary Z, where she uploads video tutorials and advice for singers and screamers. She also has a podcast, a Facebook group, and coaches singers one-on-one. And today, we've got Mary all to ourselves to talk about the science and technique behind screaming and, effectively, how to scream. Specifically, we talk about where to start, preparing your voice, warm-ups, injuries, what's happening to your body when you scream, technique, something called abstract thought, the different types of screaming, going from clean to scream, and whether anyone can learn to scream. So if you're interested in learning how to scream or getting better at screaming, or if you're just like me and are just interested to know how all this works and how people make these sounds, then this episode right here is going to rock your world. Mary seriously kicks ass and seriously knows what she's talking about. You'll notice a couple of parts where Mary is demonstrating her words with her hands and pointing to parts of her neck and face. We were talking via video stream, but I'm not sure if I'm going to do a video edit, so check the YouTube channel, otherwise you'll just have to use your imagination. So without further delay, here's Mary Zimmer and how to scream.
So some of the first things people can do is go research, like, how is a scream being produced? Like, what are the physics involved? Just so that they kind of know what they're supposed to be doing. How is it different from just actual shouting? Why could you do it safe? So basically you want information, and that is a lot of low-hanging fruit because now, as you mentioned, I have YouTube and other things. So, and for the audience, I know it sounds bad because my voice isn't very good today, but I have a little bit of bronchitis, so it's not from screaming. Just in case anyone's like, oh, this voice teacher doesn't sound very good. It doesn't actually have anything to do with that. I've never had any problems from screaming or singing, but it's just because I've fortunately had some vocal training as a bassist, So there's like easy information on YouTube. Again, though, look for vocal coaches that are serious, not just like 20-year-old kids that are like, okay, dude, so this is how you scream and you barf for a minute, like make sure that the voice teachers you're finding are really clear about the explanation of it. There's not a whole lot of us out there, but there's some of us that are good, and there are some people who are complete BS. I'm not gonna lie. Anybody can make YouTube, so you don't know if they're educated. So the idea is you want to look up some education. I mean, you can always start with Melissa Cross or myself. I can pretty much guarantee that those will be accurate. And there are some people out there using the wrong terms. If they're misspelling the words of the chords, I see this all the time. If they're too lazy to look up how to spell false chords or vocal chords, it's C-O-R-D, like a rope, not C-8, like chords, like musical chords.
Yeah.
I see that all the time on people like saying they're a vocal instructor and they put like how to false chord scream, and they're referring to some of these tissues that flap around your false chords. There are tissues that will flap in your windpipe. And they'll spell it C-H-O-R-D. So that's already a red flag. It only takes a second for them to Google if they're spelling vocal cord right. So it's just laziness. And then also, too, you want to make sure that they're also labeling things correctly, like the terms like vocal fry. A lot of people call it the distortion from the tissue flapping vocal fry, but there's actually a very seriously, named sound called vocal fry that is named from medical research, from voice doctors, that is like an actual specific, that's the name for the sound. And it's this sound. The reason why like regular voice doctors know about it is because it's been heavily researched, because people, at least in the States, will tend to talk that way as like teenagers.
Yeah.
Oh my God.
Yeah.
So say you watch a tutorial and the guy says, how to do vocal fry, and it's just raspy singing. Well, then that person also didn't look up the actual meaning of vocal fry. That's not the correct medical terminology. So just make sure that the people that you are getting your free info from really actually know what they're doing. And that may not be related to the popularity. There's some kids I know that have like a lot of subscribers that I think are just kids BSing, that aren't really like vocal coaches. So just be careful, kind of like assess the people, and also see if the things they're telling you make sense. If they don't have any clarity, then that's not a low-hanging fruit you can grab. So really, knowledge is your best low-hanging fruit as a new screamer. If you don't understand where the sounds are coming from and you just try shouting, you're going to probably hurt yourself. So knowledge, I would say, is key. And then from there, you have to start slowly learning to build skills. And you can do that from some of the knowledge that you're obtaining. But unlike just singing, if you can't scream at all, some of the low-hanging fruit doesn't matter, like moisturizing the vocal cords. Like you were talking about eating, not eating, it doesn't know that really matters if you don't know what you're doing.
Sure.
If you could do all of that and make the wrong sound and still hurt yourself.
Yeah.
So really it's how you make the sound. And then secondary would be your environmental things. If I put the wrong type of oil in an engine or something, you know what I mean? Or if I put the right type of oil in a Porsche, it won't matter if I don't know how to drive it. Let's put it that way. It's the same thing,
yeah.
I've tried to get people not to control their voice through the environment and external habits. I kind of like say your lifestyle is your lifestyle, and that's kind of weird, but Melissa Cross is kind of like of that philosophy too. And the reason is because so much of your environment and how it affects your voice will be out of your control, even if like you never smoke a cigarette or you never drink any coffee. Or so there are some things that are undeniably medically true and drying and things. Ideally you just want to keep your instrument moisturized, and that'd be the windpipe. We have to remember the vocal cords are in the trachea, not the food pipe. And sometimes I'm very specific about saying windpipe and food pipe instead of trachea and esophagus, because some people don't know.
Yeah.
So when we're drinking water, it's very good, but also it'll moisturize like your soft palate and the things inside your mouth, but you're not gonna inhale that. So we can avoid things, maybe within an hour of singing, like coffee, really tannic beverages like black teas, green teas actually are very tannic, just like coffee. All that will just dry out your soft palate. And it dries you, through your bloodstream too a little bit. So it will definitely dry the vocal folds. And smoking, of course, will cause a great deal of dryness and all of that. But at the end of the day, you may experience a similar degree of dryness, not having any of those things, just from the fact that there's air conditioning in the venue. Or today's show is in Las Vegas, and tomorrow's show is in, humid, Tennessee. I guess that's a little bit far of a driving stretch, but you know what I mean? It's so diverse, let's say in a place like the States, or even Europe, or Australia too, where the climate could change drastically from one side to the other if you're touring. So you have to kind of mitigate that. You can mitigate some of these things and just put it in your control. What I don't want is people to become so obsessed over the little environmental things that they don't learn the right technique. It's not going to help you if you shout wrong. And the other thing is that you don't want to become a diva. You'll psych yourself out. So if you feel like you always, nobody can have a fog machine and there can't be any smoking in the venue and this and that. Yes, technically those things will be bothersome for sure. But I also know a lot of very professional musicians who don't say anything about the conditions and just let them be. And what they do is they take care of the circumstances, put it in your own control. So what you can do is you can steam your voice, in any venue, in any situation, in any climate, with any lifestyle. So you can use things like mint tea, but you want to go with plain, you don't want the tannic, the blends of the black and the green tea. And I'm saying like just before an hour. If you drink coffee all day, just drink your coffee, live your life, but like an hour before the show, especially if you have drying habits, take your mint tea, put it on the table in front of you, take a towel, put it over your head and kind of drape it around and make a little steam tent. And just inhale. You can use peppermint oil. If you don't like mint, you can use like some lemon or just plain steam. That's fine too. Make sure that you let it cool enough to where maybe you could drink it, but it's still steaming. You could actually burn your face doing that. Steam burns are very real. And you don't want to inhale excruciatingly hot steam.
Yeah.
That will not help you. You could burn in there too. So just make sure you wait a little bit. But it's super great. Yeah, so somebody I coached who was in a very successful, very high-paid cover band, they would play all these smoky casinos, but they got paid a lot of money for it. And so they would do that. She would, between the sets, she would just like breathe in the steam. She doesn't smoke personally. So as far as eating goes, I really don't think that there's anything particular that you should avoid. It will be bothersome if you drink a glass of milk right before you go on stage. But again, windpipe, not food pipe.
Sure.
So, you're just trying to avoid some overproduction of mucus. So, don't eat like the spiciest thing in the world right before.
Cool.
So I really want to say that we shouldn't worry too much about that stuff. It's kind of a different take on that.
Yeah, totally. No, that makes a lot of sense, I think.
Yeah.
Taking care of yourself, because you can't always control every environment, as you say, and it would be an absolute pain in the ass to try and do so. So if you are just looking after you first and then applying that to the correct technique, then that's the best way to approach it, right?
Yeah, because you know what? This is what happens. You'll psych yourself out, and as a singer, you can't do that. If you get psychologically blocked, you won't be able to sing. There might not be anything wrong with your voice, but I'm telling you, I've experienced this. I've seen it. I've had students with like extreme degrees of this, like psychological blocking, like very extreme. So we have to kind of mitigate that right away. Your voice is connected to your abstract thought. So even though we really learn to control it in as tangible way as possible, if you psych yourself out, it's all gone. So that's why you don't want to be a diva. Because say you show up to the venue and the opening band, who's not a part of the tour package, so maybe they don't know the rules, they're the local band, has a fog machine. And you said no fog machines, because you can't handle it as a vocalist. Well, probably if you're the second band or the third band, that's going to be gone by the time you're up there, number one.
Yeah.
And number two, then that psychologically messes with you, doesn't it?
Yeah.
Now you feel like there's a condition in which you're not going to perform well, which is completely untrue. I use really good technique, and I guarantee I could perform. I've performed many times with fog machines like blowing right at me. So I can personally attest to, it's all in your technique. Use some things. If you go out with like the steam, you can even bring like the mint tea in a travel mug on stage with you. Just bring it on stage. You can bring cold water and your mint tea. Like nobody knows what's in your cup. Who cares?
Yeah.
Bring a travel mug. Like who gives a crap? Just drink it on stage then, You can mitigate all of that and you can just control it. But I've seen like tour riders, with these like umpteen requests about, and then people feel like, oh, I'm not going to do good if I don't have my 15 brown M&Ms. And it's such a or whatever they put in the rider.
Yeah.
It's such a distraction from actually just singing. And if you have really good technique, then you're going to feel like a badass and you will be able to be a consistent performer.
What about warming up? What are some of the basic things that people can do before they attempt to scream or before they do a show or before they rehearse?
So really the main thing, this is a great question. What people want to do is they definitely want to warm up before they do anything, singing or screaming. Because I'm going to tell you what, clean singers, pop singers, people who never ever do distortion, not even in like a raspy blues way, they get cocky a little bit. They think that, like there's nothing's going to happen to them, that they're not at risk for injury. But I'm telling you, I've seen just as many injuries in clean singers, if not more, than in screamers. And it's because of that, because of like a bit of naivete, like, well, I'm not doing something that extreme, so I don't need to prepare. But here's the biggest injury that happens to the clean singers and also to screamers if they don't warm up. Your blood vessels will pop. And it's because you're going from 0 to 60. You're going from like cold to screaming, or cold to like belting like Adele. She's a person who had one of these blood vessel popping injuries that I'm referring to, actually. So, wow. And that's just a famous person, but I know a lot of people. I haven't had anybody get an injury after they've taken lessons with me. I will say that, but I've heard a lot of stories from other people who come to me asking questions about their injuries, who maybe I've never seen, and people who I end up teaching later that had previous injuries. So I've seen it way more than I would really like to. It is a real risk, and it's one of the most common injuries I've seen. So you can pop a blood vessel in either your eye or your vocal fold. They're about the same thickness of tissue. They're like mucous membranes. In fact, the vocal folds are just pure white, kind of like that. So you could see how it's a really similar surface. It's not like the skin on your arm where if you get a bruise or something, it doesn't externally bleed. If you pop a blood vessel in the eye, it's extremely delicate, and the blood spreads all over. Same thing with the vocal fold. So even if you have no technical knowledge, you should probably do about 15 minutes of warm-ups. That's all you ever need to do. And that's, in fact, all I ever want people to do before they play a show. You have vocal fatigue, and people are always surprised when I say this, but I don't know why, because we're only human. We run out of energy. Singing is especially screaming, is very athletic. You'll get tired. And so you have an hourglass on there. You can't just sing for 5 hours. You can't scream for 5 hours. You definitely don't want to run the marathon before you run the marathon. You can't wear yourself out. But you do need to dilate your blood vessels. The biggest way to prevent injury is starting to warm up. And what that does is it opens your blood vessels and it will prevent popping. Because when you start to sing, even like I said, clean singing, no distortion, the blood just rushes to the head. And I'm not really sure why. But I've seen injuries like that so severe that somebody actually ended up with a detached retina from pushing too hard while they were singing and popping. Yeah. So they had to have surgery to put that back. And it was a clean singer. It was not a screamer. And one who I think does very well, who sings quite properly. So you have to dilate your blood vessels. So you need to do 15 to 20 minutes of warm-ups. And if you don't know what you're doing, again, YouTube is a fabulous resource. But one guide is you actually need to make it a warm-up. So I've seen guys on tour who will be like, I'm going to start warming up, because they'll ask me questions like, well, how come we're 30 days in and I'm losing my voice and you're not, you're fine every single day. Well, I always do my 15 minutes of warm-ups. That's really it. I don't live a particularly straight edge lifestyle or anything, I'm doing some of these steaming things. I'm doing my 15 minutes of warm-up, but I have really good technique. And your 15 minutes of warm-up has to be gradual warm-up. You can't dilate the blood vessels. You're just as much a risk for injury. So the guys on tour will just go backstage and just start singing high and loud right away backstage.
Sure.
That's not a warm-up.
Yeah.
For 15 minutes before they go out. And I'm like, oh my God. So this is why it's killing them, because that's just like singing without warming up. It's just as big of a risk. So if you're going to try to scream and you found a tutorial, you don't want to just try it out of nowhere. At the very least, get warmed up with a little bit. So I have playlists on YouTube where you could sing along with it. There's a lot of different exercises. So generally you want to go breathing exercises, low, and then high. That's the order you always want to go in. Do it, because you can prevent a tremendous amount of injury. This popping the blood vessel thing is just very crazily common. And you just don't want to do it. When it pops in the vocal fold, it immediately turns off your voice, because when the vocal cords get hoarse, it's because they're swollen from slamming, from shouting. And generally, mild hoarseness is not the end of the world. The swelling goes down after a couple of days. We get our voice back. But if you had a blood vessel pop in the vocal cord, it would be just like your eye. It immediately becomes filled with blood. And because it's completely full, it's literally a switch being shut off. When Adele was talking about her vocal cord hemorrhage, she said it was like a switch just shut off in the middle of the stage, her just disappeared. And that's exactly what it would feel like. And those things can be recovered from, but sometimes they require vascular surgery, laser surgery. Yeah. So you just really want to, I've never had that happen, but again, I had some training as a basis. So at least when I started screaming, I did start on my own. I didn't have anybody coaching me. There wasn't anybody at the time, it was a different time. But at the same time, I knew at least to do my 15 minutes of warm-ups, and I did always, and in the right order. So that's the biggest thing. And so you can find simple warm-ups on YouTube. Look at some of my playlists. Bring your phone with you and your earbuds. You can just warm up in the vet, You'll always have your warm-ups with you. You always have something to sing along with.
Yeah, well, for our listeners, I'll put a link to your warm-up playlist in the podcast description.
Okay.
So look out for that. You've been using a few terms, vocal folds. Can you give us a really basic rundown of what is actually happening to your body when you are screaming, when you're trying to scream?
Yes. Okay, sure. That's a really good question, too. Basically, screaming and singing is an aggressive push of air coming from your lungs, from beneath your lungs, to blow past tissues in the trachea to create a sound. So the tissues in your trachea function like a reed. They're tuned and shaped an awful lot like strings, which is why they're called vocal cords, although a lot of people now call them vocal folds. Either one is correct. They're both acceptable, medically correct terms. I tend to use cords a lot. I use them interchangeably, but I tend to use cords a lot because people just kind of relate to it more.
Sure.
So you basically like a reed in here. And the general idea, one of the main things about our anatomy is that, unfortunately, we don't actually have tactile nerve endings, very few of them, inside the larynx structure. The larynx is the structure that holds your vocal cords and some of the other tissues. And it sits behind the cartilage and behind your thyroid. In men, you can see where the larynx is because of the protruding hyoid bone. We know that adult men have Adam's apples and adult women do not. At puberty, the hyoid bone lengthens when the vocal cords lengthen. And in men, they lengthen very significantly. And in women, they lengthen very minimally. So this is why little boys don't have Adam's apples, and why actually it's hard to tell the difference between a little child. They kind of sound genderless. They just sound like kids.
Yeah.
If they're 8 or something, boys choir sounds like girls almost. So before puberty, our larynxes are about the same size. And then once we hit puberty, you guys go through that awful voice change. I feel terrible for you guys. You crack.
Yeah.
But it's because your larynx grows by 10 millimeters on average during puberty. So that's a really long change.
Yeah.
A woman's only will grow by 3.
Wow.
So the shape of the reed is different. So this is why some people have a low voice and men sound like men and women sound like women and all this other stuff. I'm a female with a low voice, yet I don't have a long larynx. And we have to think about the way strings are tuned. So the longer the larynx, in men we hear a lower voice. You think about a bass string, but a woman with a low voice is going to have very fat vocal cords. That's what it is. They're like the thickest string on a guitar or something like that.
Sure.
Where it'd be a short string for sure, but the cords are kind of fat. So the thinness and the thickness. So a man could have the same length as another man, but if his cords are thinner, he'll be a tenor. If they're a little thicker, he might be a baritone, you know? So it kind of works like that for how the ranges are set. It's based on the physics. And then beyond that, though, really the air does the work. It really is like a reed. And it's all controlled, unfortunately, by our abstract thought. When we sing, normally, our vocal cords, they sit perpendicular to the windpipe, like this. So when we look down at them, it's like this, and they come together like this. They undulate at the frequency of the note that you're singing, basically. They also lengthen and shorten to match the pitches automatically. Again, we don't have tactile nerve endings in there, so we don't really feel it. And this is why many times we actually don't feel the slamming of the chords. We just end up getting hoarse. If you could actually feel your chords slapping together when you shout incorrectly, you would stop doing it. It'd be very painful. Not that it doesn't hurt. It starts to kind of hurt, but it's not. If you slap your hands together, which have a tremendous amount of tactile nerve endings, it hurts. If somebody gives you a high five too hard, it hurts.
Yeah.
So your voice would hurt. So it doesn't hurt because evolutionarily, we need that to be there in case of an emergency. So that basically you could just shout and slam your chords together when you need help.
Sure.
And so that it doesn't hurt. So that's a bad thing when we sing, though, because then we're going to go hoarse, and it does start to hurt, but not till like after you get hoarse. And really most of the pain that we're feeling at that point is from the extrinsic muscles in the neck, not from the vocal folds themselves. So it's really tough. We have just very little nerve feeling in there. It goes on your automatic thought. Think about everything that you say. So all the lengthening and shortening and the pitch changing, when I'm speaking, it's happening automatically. If we were to speak in one pitch, it would be monotone like this, like like a robot or a computer. So everything we say is a different pitch. So we already do this all the time with speaking. So your larynx is doing that. It's lengthening, it's shortening as you're changing the pitches automatically based on what you feel. And it's using air to cause the cords to vibrate, like blowing through a reed on a clarinet. Or using your lips in a brass mouthpiece is kind of another way to think of it. If you took away your head and your resonator cavities, the vocal cords would just buzz like people's lips, like a brass mouth. Actually, more like a brass mouthpiece if you took it off of the brass instrument.
Oh, that's weird.
Yeah, it would just buzz. It'd be like kind of like that. Like it'd be really weird. So it really wouldn't make proper notes. And it's interesting because that's what happens to a brass mouthpiece. But suddenly if you put it on a French horn, it sounds like a lovely instrument. If you put it on a trumpet, it sounds like a different instrument. The resonators are shaped a little differently. And it's the same for people. You could have a bunch of baritones and have them all sound differently, but the physics of their face and their resonator cavities are different. They are unique. People's vocal ranges tend to be very similar within the categories, like high, medium, and low, but you can still tell who your favorite singers are because voice print identification is unique to individuals because your face and your chest and your resonator cavities are shaped differently.
Yeah.
So when we sing properly, even underneath distortion, like raspy, bluesy singing, hey, we want to make sure that the vocal folds themselves are not slamming. They're very delicate. We just want them to undulate nicely. If we're squeezing our throat and not using it like a reed, and we're trying to put effort into here, we won't really see much results. If you slam the clarinet on the table, the reed, it doesn't really make any sound. And it's the same thing with our voice. But because it's abstract, it just starts slamming because we're like, I want to scream. We don't know how to prevent that. We actually have to gain some control over that. Unfortunately, though, you don't have conscious control. Tactile nerve endings also give you direct control. So I can't be like, raise your larynx, lower your larynx, open your cords, close your cords.
Yeah.
If I could, it would be much easier to learn how to sing. So we use actually abstract thought and sounds that will cause the motions that we want, but it is somewhat indirect. But I try to make it as direct as possible by knowing exactly which sounds cause which motions, and then training you guys to do that so you can control it through your abstract thought, but in a very tangible, like direct way. And then for screaming, what's happening is, in addition to your vocal folds, there's a number of other tissues inside the trachea and the windpipe that are not smooth. And so all the tissues above the vocal cords. So really now we're getting into like just the top of the windpipe and the soft palate back here and the hanging ball in the back called the uvula and also the sinuses. So all the tissues basically from here up within our air respiratory passage can be shaked around to create distortion. And that's where distortion should come from. Some people have a raspy voice without shaking any of those tissues. They're sort of just naturally raspy, and that in case there's something wrong with the vocal folds. The vocal folds themselves should be smooth. Most unintentional rasp, where people are kind of permanently raspy, comes from a weakness in one of the cords, an air escaping actually. The second most common cause of distortion without the other tissues is something along the surface, an obstruction like a polyp, a blister, a callus, something like that, usually as a result of long-term repeated vocal cord slamming. But many people just go raspy because they had an illness, and you can hear like my voice is not that great now when I have the bronchitis. Well, if you have bronchitis or severe flu or something, you can get nerve weakness in your vocal folds, and it's very, very, very common. So some people feel like, well, I'm just naturally raspy, but really it's just that they had like a cold or something when they were a kid, or even recently, and it's just made their cord a little bit weak, and now they're not getting full closure, and it's kind of causing raspiness because there's air escaping. The cords need to touch all the way along as they undulate, with even pressure in order for it to sound smooth.
Wow.
And so we can do that simultaneously while we shake around those tissues, which is proper raspy singing, which doesn't hurt the voice. Some people do just luckily stumble onto this, like Steven Tyler's of the world and the people who've doing it for like 50 years. But they just keep doing it because it doesn't hurt. Like the thing about it is doing that feels a little tingly, but it doesn't like hurt. And you don't get hoarse. So you're like, oh, okay. You just keep doing it if you naturally figure it out. Most people, though, do not naturally figure it out and need a lot of guidance to kind of not do that. So that's what's happening in there. It's kind of detail, but
Yeah, man, that's intense. Such a process. What I really want to know is, you've explained like the differences, like how distortion is made. How do you do that? Like on a basic level, from singing cleanly to adding distortion on purpose, correctly.
we have to use our abstract thought to direct the air to those tissues. And so it would be wonderful if I could just say, like, point your windpipe like a little to the left, or whatever.
Yeah.
Like it doesn't do that. And all day from talking, like I was saying, there's all this stuff going on here. You can't feel it. It's just happening automatically. And so we have to kind of figure out a way to tap into the abstract thought, the thing that controls your voice. Raw emotions will just make it slam and it won't go to those tissues. So emotions are good when we talk and kind of bad when we sing until we learn proper technique. Once we learn proper technique, we can direct our adrenaline to the correct movements and it can be helpful again. But what you want to do is I actually start people with impersonation first, but specific impersonation, like talking in a raspy demon voice and telling people, imitate me, sort of imitating Dave Mustaine.
Yeah.
Talking like me, something like that.
Yeah.
And most of the time that little impersonation actually is powerful enough, but it's very delicate. It's quiet, we're not shouting, we're speaking, that's kind of the key, is we're not just like yelling something. It's not like this crazy thing. We're starting like a low pitch, again, start like low, kind of do some talking. And you might start to feel some tingling in some of those tissues that I mentioned. It very much feels like tingling, not pain. It feels like almost like, when your leg falls asleep, just like that kind of tingling. You can't flap tissues around in the windpipe and not feel it. But it's a completely different sensation than pain, gripping, sharp pain, aching pain, hoarseness, all that stuff. Well, sometimes though, people will go to do that and they will get it wrong. I'll have a student that will go to do that and they'll end up doing this, which is not what we want to do. This is the Louis Armstrong. Me, like that. That's where our false chords, which sit right above the vocal cords, they're tissues that sit right above them, they will actually touch. And we actually end up singing two pitches at once. That's the Tibetan throat singer.
Yeah.
They're touching two chords, vocal folds and the false chords together. But the problem with that is that's not actually proper distortion. It's not particularly distorted. That's not what you're hearing your favorite singers doing. They're mostly flapping around the soft palate and the sinuses and kind of leaving this alone. The false chords actually don't get involved too much except for in false chord screaming, which is a certain sound that flaps those tissues around specifically. So what happens if somebody can't do it? They get the froggy thing. They're not able to kind of drive it into those facial tissues. I've got like a ton of exercises that are kind of advanced and take forever. It takes a lot of coaching. We start with that imitation and we'll change it and alter the sounds to start driving it at the correct tissues. And some of it we do with our imagination. We actually tap into the abstract thought and we imagine the distortion going into the hard palate, kind of at an angle like this, and up away from the throat. And when you do that, it will drive it into the sinuses and the soft palate, and it will begin to shake around some of the tissues, because it isn't magic, because that's how your voice works. It responds to the abstract thought. It does it accurately all day without you thinking about it. When you control it with your mind like that, you can be very specific, and it actually will point the windpipe at those tissues.
Wow.
The weird thing is, though, you just hear the difference in the sound. You don't feel it too much.
Yeah.
You'll feel like the distortion going to the right place and moving away from your throat, but you can't feel like the wind pointing here or the wind pointing there. So you just kind of literally use your mind to control it. comes from classical technique. They've been doing this for centuries, using placement, they call it, where you imagine your sound traveling a certain direction. It causes actions in the larynx. It causes changes. But like I said, I can't be like, hey, fold your epiglottis over halfway,
Yeah.
Like, doesn't work like that. So you have to find ways that will make the sound happen. And I've been very successful at finding those. And so that's kind of where that comes from and how to start doing that. But it may take a lot of coaching. So
Yeah, I imagine. Now, is there sort of one technique, because there are lots of different types of screams, right? Or different types of sounds that you can make that are distorted. You've got guttural sounds, high-pitched sounds. There's the guys that sing high-pitched kind of power metal sort of screaming, almost scream singing. There's tons of different sounds. Are you essentially doing the same thing but shaping your mouth differently, or is it just pointing the direction of the energy into different parts of your face and your resonator, rather?
that is very confusing, right? So because of that, I've tried to divide it into 3 categories to keep it very simple. But within these 3 categories, you can do a lot. And so people can be doing the same things and sound a little bit different. Again, everybody's resonator is shaped a little differently. So it could feel like there's way more types of screaming than there actually are. So we divide it into 3 kinds. The 3 main kinds are false chord screaming, voice with distortion, and fry screaming. So we're going to go through the 3. False chord screaming is voiceless, where our vocal folds are not singing. They're not creating the pitch. In all of these, there's an inherent sense of pitch. But in full distortion screams, your voice should not be involved at all, actually. Your vocal folds should just be kind of out of the process. We actually just make noise with those shaky tissues.
Wow.
So it sounds very brutal, but it's actually quite benign. And there has been now enough research for us to know what's happening. But screaming like this has maybe been around for only 30 years, maybe since like 1989 or so. So it doesn't, as far as like the voiceless sounds, the voiced ones have been around since the Delta Blues, which would be almost 100 years now. So we have to kind of put it in perspective that, we finally are just at a point where we even know how these sounds are being made.
Yeah.
And that we can kind of set a standard for that. So we know that false chord screaming is voiceless. Your vocal folds actually sit open during this sound, and they don't even touch. So there's no slamming. They're just chilling. And the reason why it gets its name is because this is the one where the false chords do flap around a little bit. And those sit right above the vocal cords. They look like fat pink bands, like a fake set of second chords, And like I said, some cultures use them, the Tibetan throat singers. But we should be flapping them, not touching them. So when actually we see a video of someone doing this, we can see their vocal folds open. Actually, the trachea is not very wide. I go like this because it feels like that. But honestly, it looks like this.
Yeah.
Like it's super tiny. Because even in a man with a long larynx, think about how big your neck is. It's like not that big of a tube. Your food tube's still in there somewhere. It's like not, it's kind of small still. So it's like a hole like this. Your vocal cords are literally, they just look like an O. And then you can see the false cords going like, like that.
Yeah.
That's what they look like. They look like they go like this. And then also we have the other tissues simultaneously going, but it's the only scream that really does shake the false chords a lot. The other 2 primarily just shake these tissues up in the soft palate and the sinuses, and you don't see much false chord flapping in the videos. And I don't really feel it either. So when I false chord scream, I think the reason why you can flap the false chords is because the vocal cords are open and it's right there. In the other ones, the cords are making some kind of contact and we're not having that much wind flow at that point. So I think that's why that doesn't happen. So false chord screaming is like your death metal screaming, like traditional death metal though, like Cannibal Corpse and all that. Mm-hmm. Although I would say some famous, more up-to-date false chord screamers would be like Lauren Hart of Once Human, for sure. That's all she does is false chord screaming. And I've interviewed her, so I know for sure that. Yeah. And then the second thing is Angela Gasso from Arch Enemy, the previous singer. So there's a few out there that are not just in the old school style. So it's kind of like, he, you, you can hear I'm not going ye, you, you can hear that my voice is not in that. So my vocal folds are sitting open and I'm just flapping the tissues around. But I am doing that by making a sound that does that. I can't consciously like hold my vocal folds open.
Yeah.
We don't have that kind of neurological connection to the voice. We do to our hands and many parts of our body. But unfortunately, this is the only part of your body that the abstract thought controls. So you learn to make a sound that will cause that action. And then we learn, like all the other sounds, to drive it as much as we can off the throat and in. We still don't want the false chord. It's not that.
Yeah.
It's not the false chords touching. It's the false chords flapping. So that's type number 1. And we have a high, medium, and low on each of these voiceless sounds. And that is done by changing the vowel shape. You could have like 6 different genres of screams, but they might all be doing fry screaming or all be doing false chord screaming, but they're changing the pitch by the shape of the mouth and sort of using the Doppler effect and the proximity effect to change the pitch.
Sure.
By making the same noise. Since we can't change the pitch with our voice, right? So, yeah, you, like different pitches of false chord, but I just changed my mouth. I'm just making the same sound. So this is why you could have like one guy false chord screaming that's in like a different kind of band and another kind of metal band. They could be using it differently a little bit.
Yeah.
Then you have voice with rasp, which is where your vocal cords are making contact like normal. They still shouldn't be slamming underneath. They should just be doing their normal singing underneath and simultaneously flapping any of these tissues around. The false chords don't really get engaged. So actually the throat really doesn't feel... Most people, when I teach them, are very surprised to find out how much their throat doesn't feel anything. It just feels normal. You feel the tingling, again, in the soft palate and the sinuses, where we tend to shake those tissues around. And so that's any pitch with rasp. That could be like the hair metal guys you were talking about. You could do distortion on high notes like that. You can do it simultaneously, like the Steven Tylers of the world. Or you can do it like talking with rasp. You can do it yelling with distortion, whatever you want to do. So anything with voice and distortion at the same time, that's what's happening. Your vocal cords should be singing normally underneath, and the distortion should be coming from up here. And then it doesn't hurt at all either. So again, it shouldn't be slamming or doing anything like that. Just a little bit of tingling sensation there. And so that's a pretty broad category, though, because there's a million ways to sing.
Yeah.
So we hear raspy singing, like I said, as far back as the 1930s, the Delta blues recordings. That would probably be the origin of it, at least to the Western world, would be African-American, people of color in the States playing blues music. Blues music eventually became rock and roll and spread throughout everything. So we hear raspy singing somebody like Bruno Mars, who's doing R&B, and we hear it in rock music. We hear it in blues music. We hear it in talking. We hear it in voice acting. It would be all the same category. Anything that has your voice in it, whether it's a hair metal thing or just a low thing, doesn't matter. Voice with distortion is one category. And you want to be using your voice normally and simultaneously shaking the tissues. So there's a lot you could do with that, but I put it into one category. And then the third one is fry screaming. And that's like false chord where it's full distortion and you're just shaking around the tissues. But your vocal folds are actually completely closed like this. They actually don't move. They're not slamming either. It doesn't hurt the voice at all to do. But it's, again, kind of bringing back this... the brass instrument thing, it's really like that when we fry scream. And so then this would give it like a different scale. It's like false chord where it's high, medium, and low as well from the shape of the mouth. So you could have many genres of people. Full distortion, fry screaming, we hear in nu metal, like Chester Bennington. That's really where we start to hear it.
Yep.
Static X, we're throwing back to the 90s there.
Deftones, right?
Deftones, without a doubt, yeah. But then you also hear it in black metal. You hear it in Swedish Melodeath. It's pretty much all fry screaming, not false chord. It's just like a medium fry. Randy Blythe is medium fry screaming. And then people can do really extreme lows. There's also a low fry. And that tends to sound like the pig squeal toilet bowl low, like Suicide Silence, Whitechapel, Thy Art is Murder, that kind of
stuff, right?
Yes, and that would be low fry screaming, which is doing low with your vocal folds closed. And so that's why sometimes people get squeals and overtones. It's not their voice. It's just that they're pushing air through like a really tiny space. And so sometimes they'll separate a little bit and you actually can whistle between your vocal folds while you're fry screaming.
Wow.
So it's really weird. It's like when we hear Danny Filth do like a really ridiculous whistle tone, he's a grown man. He's not singing a whistle tone, He's fry screaming. It only happens when he's screaming. It's distorted generally. And his vocal folds are shut, but he finds a breath pressure point to which part of the releases, and you're actually whistling between your vocal folds. Not everybody can do that. I actually can't do the whistle fry, and I think it's because if you have a fatter set of vocal folds, I don't think that you can really do that. I don't think they'll open like that. So not everybody can do them. It doesn't have to do with your vocal range, but your vocal range is an indicator of the length and thickness of your cord. So I would imagine Danny Filth might naturally be a baritone or a tenor or something. He's certainly not a bass. I mean, he doesn't sing, so it doesn't really matter. But the point is that his chords are not too thick, so he's able to hit that point. Maria Brink does it too with the whistle fries, but she's really like a soprano, so her chords wouldn't be too fat either. Same thing with Heidi the Butcher. You hear her a lot do it too, but she's got a higher singing voice. So, the chords are probably more likely to separate and allow a whistle tone to happen. I find like basses and contraltos like myself, we're kind of shit out of luck on the whistle tones.
Yeah.
So my fries are pretty good, but I don't know if they'll be that good with my larynx, but we'll see how it goes. So if I change the shape, it changes the pitch.
Yeah.
It's not, I'm not shouting. There's a lot of overtones, so it can be a little misleading, but my voice is not in it, I assure you. But there's a lot of harmonic overtones, but again, it's not something I can feel. It doesn't feel tight. I don't feel them shutting. I don't actually know they're shutting. The only way we know is we've observed people doing this. So I have to teach people to make sounds that will make them shut.
Yeah.
Because I wish I could just say, close your chords and hold them there. Doesn't work like that.
It's something that I see quite often is singers that want to start screaming and they're scared that it's going to damage their singing voice, and they're wondering about transitioning between singing and screaming maybe in the same song. What would you say to singers who are worried about maybe damaging their actual clean singing voice by trying to scream? Is that a thing?
There's a lot of myths about that. If you hurt yourself, it might stay raspy, but you'd have to honestly do some serious damage. Like I said, we don't get polyps and weird things along the surface unless we've been like repeating slamming and repeating hoarseness for like several months. The only like damage that happens like immediately is those blood vessel bursting things, Otherwise, like it's going to take a while. And maybe like if people have the fold weakness from, being sick or something.
Yeah.
But in general, it should not affect your clean singing at all. But you have to learn why people might hurt their clean singing is if they're not doing the rasp properly. If you're not doing it from your, if you're trying just to shout, first of all, it won't be very raspy because your vocal cords, if they're healthy, and you're just shouting from the throat and you're slamming them together, so that would feel like pretty tight and it would feel very unproductive, like you're not getting much distortion no matter how loud you get and no matter how hard you yell. That will cause you to become hoarse, certainly. It could damage your clean singing. Again, if you repeat that, you will get polyps or calluses. You can get contact ulcers, like sores from repeating the slamming. There's a whole bunch of things you can get, but that would take a long time. So basically, you want to make sure that you get some education and that you try to do it from the other tissues and not from your vocal cords, and that you just don't start shouting, because it's not going to be very distorted. Again, if there's nothing wrong with your chords, even if they're slamming, they're not going to be particularly distorted. Only these other tissues create the distortion. If your windpipe and your face and the back of your throat were smooth, you actually would not be able to create any distortion. So if you don't engage those tissues, your voice should not be distorted. And when you're engaging them, your voice underneath is still not distorted. It's only those tissues. You're just doing two things at once. So you should be able to go right back from distortion, even those extreme sounds I was doing, and immediately into clean singing. The reason why people can't is because if they're going from screaming to singing and they can't, they're shouting when they're not screaming properly.
Sure.
If you're screaming properly, like I was talking about, your vocal cords they're not doing anything. They shouldn't be slamming at all. And so this is why I can make these 6 screams and go back from fry screaming to like in White Empress, I would go like to opera singing even, because it's not swelling my vocal folds. So they should be functioning. As soon as I stop engaging those other tissues, they should be functioning like normal. And we turn them off and turn them on by using feelings and our abstract thought to direct the sound into those areas, when we want them and when we don't want them.
Yeah.
Certain mental picture for this sound, different one for this sound. So you can put it on and take it away at will. But if it's coming from the right tissues, it should not be an issue at all. If you can't go back to clean singing, something's wrong with your screaming and you're making yourself hoarse. That's the bottom line. So don't let anybody tell you that.
Finally, is it for everybody? Can anyone learn how to scream and add it into their repertoire?
I believe they can, but you have to have a really good coach. That's the thing. I have this theory about hard work beats talent when talent doesn't work hard. So some people do get natural abilities and can do some things a little. I've had students that are more inclined to distortion and will learn the techniques much faster than others. And that's just, we all have our own natural inclinations. But nobody has not learned it from me. But some of the people who are not naturally inclined will have to spend more time on it.
Sure.
It's very difficult. These are all very advanced techniques. And so I really do believe that anybody who wants to put the work in can do it, but you have to find the right coach who knows what they're doing. One of the most frustrating things is if you have the wrong coach and they don't have like very effective methods of showing you how to do it, because it is rather abstract and it's rather advanced, and that's why there's not too many of us doing it. Guys, it's unrealistic to try to learn this from a video. Like, it's just really unrealistic. Like, my tutorials are great, but they're not necessarily. I have a full load of students from all over the world every week. Why? Because it's not realistic to learn from a video.
Yeah.
Because everybody is an individual.
Yeah.
And you may not, and some techniques, quite frankly, I do not want people doing on their own.
Yeah.
I only put up the things I think are kind of fairly safe to try and experiment with as well. There's a ton of things that you need coaching and guidance through, and you have to really think of yourself like an athlete. If you work hard enough, you can bench, the certain weight or whatever, And with the voice, it's less restrictive because sometimes with athleticism, there are some physical limitations. But with the voice, for the most part, it's a smaller thing. It doesn't matter like our age or our physical size or ability. It just is like how hard you're willing to work, really, and how hard you're willing to practice. Because it might take you a year, and if it takes someone a month. And that doesn't mean that there's anything wrong with you. That's just life. You may just have to work a little harder. But basically, everybody I've ever taught who wanted to stick with it did learn it.
Cool.
So I really feel like as long as you want to put the effort in, if you quit early because it's frustrating and hard to do, you'll never learn it, because it is hard to do. And it is frustrating. And the learning process sucks. And I'm just upfront with my people about that. I'm like, hey, this is not going to be fun necessarily. But if you stick with it, you will learn it just like an athlete. I mean, think about the NBA or the NFL or something. Like, not everybody is Kobe Bryant. Okay, they don't not all have the natural gifts, but there's like hundreds of people that are professional athletes. Well, they've all had a shitload of coaches their whole lives, a shitload of practice. Look at it like that, that it's a skill that you need to practice like that. So
awesome. Hey, Mary, thank you so much. That was absolutely incredible. Thanks for coming on the podcast and sharing your knowledge with us.
Well, thank you so much for having me. It's been a pleasure. This is a great podcast. Thank you so much for having me.
And there we have it, folks. A huge thank you to Mary Z. You'll find links to all her music projects, social media pages, and her YouTube channel in the episode notes, as well as a link to her warm-up playlist. But right now, you need to check her out on the following links: her Facebook pages, facebook.com/VoiceHacks and facebook.com/Mary Zimmer Official. Her Facebook group, Singers Sanctuary, facebook.com/groups/VH Singers Sanctuary. And her awesome YouTube channel, youtube.com/VoiceHacks by Mary Z. Mary's choice for Artist of the Week is death metal band Once Human, which I just learned was founded by Logan Mader, who was in Soulfly and Machine Head. So check them out at facebook.com/oncehuman. So that's it. Thanks for listening. Make sure to subscribe to the podcast and get involved with the Facebook pages and email list to keep updated on the next episode. This podcast and the website musiciansmap.org is dedicated to sharing knowledge and advice about music and the music industry. It's all about community, honesty, and positive progress. The experiences, stories, and advice shared on the podcast are given freely with the hope that you can relate to them and benefit from them. If you've found this podcast enjoyable or useful, make sure to check out the Musician's Map ebook and audiobook about building success in music. You'll find it at musiciansmap.org/books, Amazon, and Audible. And buying a copy of the book directly contributes to the continuation of this podcast. There's also a free ebook, How to Get Your Music Heard. Go to musiciansmap.org/free-book to get your copy. If you have a suggestion for the podcast or for the YouTube channel, or you just want to get in touch and say hello, please do so via the Musician's Map Facebook group or by email at kane@musiciansmap.org. Thanks for listening and stay positive.